In the late 1930s, as the shadow of the swastika lengthened across Europe, the leaders of In the late 1930s, as the shadow of the swastika lengthened across Europe, the leaders of the Third Reich looked across the Atlantic Ocean. They saw a massive continent, a giant industrial engine, and a population of 130 million people. But they did not see a rival. They did not see a threat. When Adolf Hitler and his inner circle looked at the United States of America, they saw only one thing: a mistake. To understand why Germany lost the Second World War, we must first understand this fundamental blindness. It wasn't just an intelligence failure. It was an ideological one. This is the story of cultural degeneracy, the fatal arrogance of the Nazi elite. Adolf Hitler never set foot in the United States. He never saw the steel mills of Pittsburgh or the vast wheat fields of Kansas. His entire understanding of America was constructed from a bizarre mixture of Karl May's adventure novels, books about the Wild West written by a German who had also never been to America, and Hollywood movies. To the Nazi elite, America was not a nation. It was a corporation masquerading as a country. In the halls of Berlin, they spoke of the United States with a sneering contempt. They believed in the concept of Kultur, a deep, spiritual, centuries-old German heritage. In contrast, they viewed American society as civilization, a soulless, mechanical shell, driven only by the pursuit of the dollar. But the disdain went deeper than just economics. It was rooted in the core of Nazi ideology: race. The Nazis were obsessed with racial purity. They believed that strength came from blood and soil. When they looked at the American melting pot, they were horrified. Where Americans saw a strength in diversity, Hitler saw biological decay. In his private monologues, preserved by his secretaries, Hitler frequently referred to America as a mongrel nation. He described it as half Judaized, half negrified. In the Nazi worldview, a society composed of so many different immigrant groups, religions, and races could never possess the unity of will required to fight a modern war. They believed that, in a time of crisis, the American social fabric would simply tear apart. German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels amplified this message. The German newspapers were filled with caricatures of Americans. They weren't depicted as soldiers. They were depicted as gangsters, corrupt millionaires, or shallow celebrities. The image of the Chicago mobster was taken as the reality of the American character: violent, yes, but undisciplined and loyal to nothing but money. And then there was the culture itself. Nothing disgusted the Nazi establishment more than American jazz and swing music. They called it entartete Musik, degenerate music. They saw the wild dancing of the jazz age not as an expression of freedom, but as a symptom of mental and moral illness. A famous German report from the late 1930s, written by the travel writer Colin Ross, who was sympathetic to the Nazis, described American youth as soft. Ross reported back to Berlin that the young men of America were obsessed with comfort, cars, and movies. He wrote that they lacked the heroic spirit of the Hitler youth. He told Hitler exactly what Hitler wanted to hear: that America was a hollow shell, rotting from the inside out. The German general staff, usually more pragmatic, fell into the same trap. They looked at the strikes in American factories during the Great Depression and saw a prelude to a communist revolution or a civil war. They believed that the United States was so internally divided by class and race that it could never mobilize for a foreign war. This was the ideological hubris. The Nazis projected their own values onto the world. They believed that because they had marched in lockstep, only those who marched in lockstep were strong. They mistook the chaotic, noisy, arguing nature of American democracy for weakness. They looked at the American soldier and saw a man who drank Coca-Cola and chewed gum, and they assumed he couldn't fight. They looked at the Hollywood skyline and saw Jewish influence, assuming it meant cowardice. This cultural blindness led to the ultimate strategic error. Hitler believed he could fight a war in Europe, and that the United States, even if it entered the conflict, would be too corrupt, too racially divided, and too culturally soft to sustain the fight. He thought he was facing a decayed country. He didn't realize that the very things he despised, the mix of cultures, the industrial capitalism, the individual freedom, were actually the components of a new kind of superpower. As 1941 approached, the Nazi regime sat comfortably in their superiority, convinced that the mongrel nation across the sea was no match for the master race. They were about, in 1939, while the German Wehrmacht was perfecting the terrifying art of blitzkrieg, crushing Poland in weeks and preparing to sweep through France, the United States Army was, by European standards, a joke. To the disciplined, battle-hardened Prussian generals sitting in Berlin, the American military was not just small. It was pathetic. When World War II began in Europe, the United States Army ranked roughly 17th or 19th in the world in size. It was smaller than the Army of Portugal. It was smaller than the Army of Romania. To the German general staff, who measured power in divisions and iron discipline, the idea that this tiny force could challenge the masters of Europe was laughable. This chapter in history is defined by a single dangerous illusion: the belief that a civilian nation could not produce professional warriors. German military attaches stationed in Washington, D.C. sent detailed reports back to Berlin. What they saw confirmed their biases. They observed American military maneuvers in Louisiana in 1940 and 1941, and they were unimpressed. They saw soldiers training with wooden sticks instead of rifles because of supply shortages. They saw trucks driving around with the word tank painted on the side because the U.S. didn't have enough actual tanks to practice with. General Friedrich von Boeticher, the German military attaché in Washington, was a key figure in this miscalculation. He was intelligent and well-read, but he suffered from the same blindness as his superiors. He reported that while Americans were good with machines, they lacked the warrior soul. He described the American soldier not as a fighter, but as a uniformed civilian, undisciplined, spoiled by comfort, and incapable of the brutal, unquestioning obedience required in total war. The Germans called them kriegsunwillig, unwilling to make war. This skepticism was rooted in the deep tradition of Prussian militarism. In Germany, the army was the state. In America, the army was a temporary necessity. German generals looked at the American officer corps and saw men who acted like business managers, not aristocratic leaders. They mocked the American reliance on logistics and supply chains, viewing it as a crutch for a lack of tactical brilliance. When the United States finally entered the war after Pearl Harbor, Hitler remained unimpressed. He famously dismissed the Americans as cowboys, a derogatory term implying they were reckless amateurs playing with guns. He believed that an army raised from a mongrel democratic society would crack under the pressure of real combat against the Aryan elite. For a brief moment in early 1943, it seemed the Germans were right. The first major clash between American and German ground forces took place at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. It was a disaster for the United States. Experienced German troops, led by the legendary Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, smashed through the American lines. The American troops were green. Their leadership was confused. Their discipline crumbled. They fled, leaving behind equipment and dignity. To the German high command, Kasserine Pass was the proof they had been waiting for. It validated every report, every racial theory, and every sneering joke. Rommel himself observed that the Americans had excellent equipment but didn't know how to use it. They believed they were fighting a quantity over quality enemy, an army of well-fed, gum-chewing children who would run away when the going got tough. But this was the fatal error of the German assessment. They judged the Americans by how they started, not by how fast they could learn. They failed to understand that the undisciplined nature of the American soldier was actually a different kind of strength, initiative. The German army relied on rigid command structures. The American army, born from a democratic and individualistic society, was chaotic but incredibly adaptable. After the humiliation of Kasserine Pass, the U.S. Army didn't collapse. It restructured. They fired incompetent commanders and promoted aggressive ones like George Patton. They analyzed their mistakes with the cold logic of an engineer. The cowboys stopped playing and started learning the grim business of war at a speed that the rigid German military mind could not comprehend. The Germans saw the wooden rifles of 1940 and assumed the U.S. would always be amateur. They didn't realize that the army of cowboys was backed by a culture that treated war like a massive industrial problem to be solved. By the time the Germans realized their mistake, that the spoiled Americans were becoming lethal professionals, the Wehrmacht was already being ground into dust. The skepticism of 1939 had become the nightmare of 1944. In the mind of Adolf Hitler, there was a fatal separation between commerce and combat. He looked at the United States in the 1930s and saw a nation obsessed with comfort. He saw a people who measured their success by the number of automobiles in their driveways and the electric refrigerators in their kitchens. To the Führer, this consumerism was proof of weakness. He famously scoffed that the Americans were a people who knew how to make nothing but razors and fridges. This was perhaps the single greatest miscalculation of the entire war. Hitler failed to understand that the ability to mass-produce a refrigerator is exactly the same skill required to mass-produce a tank. German industry was built on the tradition of the craftsman. It was a culture of engineering perfection. When Germany built a tank like the fearsome Tiger, it was a masterpiece of complex machinery. Each one was hand-finished, over-engineered, and incredibly sophisticated. But they took forever to build, and when they broke down in the mud of Russia or the sands of France, they required specialized parts and expert mechanics to fix. The German leaders looked down on Fordism, the American system of the assembly line, as soulless and inferior. They believed that war was an art form, not a manufacturing process. They could not conceive that a country run by businessmen could defeat a country run by warriors. Then came 1942, and the fridges stopped coming. Almost overnight, the United States government ordered the cessation of civilian automobile production. The greatest industrial engine the world had ever seen stopped making sedans and started making instruments of death. The sheer scale of this transformation is difficult to comprehend even today. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler didn't just tweak their factories. They completely reimagined what was possible. The most terrifying example for the Germans was the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford. German intelligence couldn't believe the reports. It was a factory with an assembly line over a mile long. At its peak, Willow Run was producing one B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. The Germans were building aircraft one by one. The Americans were baking them like loaves of bread. The German strategic worldview was shattered by the concept of interchangeability. In the German army, a part for one vehicle might not fit another vehicle of the same model because of slight manufacturing variations. In the American army, a spark plug from a Jeep could fit a generator. An engine from a tank could be swapped in the field. This was the Fordism that Hitler had mocked. It wasn't about making cheap goods. It was about the logistics of reliability. The discrepancy became painfully obvious on the battlefield. A German Tiger tank could destroy 5 American Sherman tanks before being taken out. The Germans took pride in this ratio. But what they didn't account for was that for every Sherman they destroyed, the Detroit assembly lines had already built 10 more to replace it. There is a famous anecdote from a captured German soldier in 1944. When asked when he knew the war was lost, he didn't mention a specific battle. He said he knew it was over when he saw the Americans delivering fresh chocolate cakes to the front lines in airplanes. He realized that if the enemy had enough fuel, planes, and logistics to fly pastry to a war zone, Germany could never compete with their resources. The Nazis had bet everything on the idea that superior German engineering would triumph. They learned too late that in a total war, perfection is the enemy of the good. While Germany was building the best tanks in the world, America was building the most tanks in the world. By 1945, the nation of shopkeepers and fridge manufacturers had crushed the Third Reich not just with bravery, but with an avalanche of steel. The United States had produced two-thirds of all the military equipment used by the Allies in the entire war. The industrial might that Hitler had dismissed as a sign of decadence turned out to be the ultimate weapon of the modern age. The assembly line defeated the warrior caste. Geography is often the most dangerous liar in warfare. When Adolf Hitler and his high command looked at the map of the world in 1941, they saw the Atlantic Ocean not as a highway but as a wall. They saw 3,000 miles of treacherous water that separated the fortress of Europe from the factories of America. This vast blue expanse was the foundation of the Atlantic barrier illusion, the belief that the war could be kept in Europe, far from the American mainland. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared war on the United States. It is often cited by historians as his single greatest strategic blunder. But to Hitler, it made perfect sense based on a flawed calculation. He was banking on the two-front illusion. Berlin was convinced that the Japanese Empire would act as a massive distraction. The German logic was simple. If the United States was fighting for its life in the Pacific against the Japanese Navy, it would not have the ships, the men, or the will to cross the Atlantic and fight in Europe. They believed the U.S. was now trapped in a defensive war on its own doorstep. Hitler reportedly remarked that America cannot come to Europe for 5 or 10 years. For the first 6 months of 1942, it appeared the Germans were right. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, launched Operation Drumbeat, Paukenschlag. They sent U-boats directly to the American East Coast. It was a slaughter. German submarine commanders called it the second happy time. They sank hundreds of Allied ships right off the coast of Florida, New Jersey, and North Carolina. The night skies of Atlantic City were illuminated by burning oil tankers. From the periscope of a U-boat, the Atlantic barrier seemed impenetrable. The Germans believed they could strangle the supply line before it even left American waters. They calculated the tonnage of ships they were sinking and assured Hitler that Britain would starve, and America would be locked out of the war. But the Germans had made two critical errors. First, they underestimated the American capacity to multitask. Second, they misunderstood the nature of the ocean. While Germany was fighting a war of annihilation in Russia, struggling to supply its troops on a single land front, the United States decided to do the impossible. Fight two full-scale wars on opposite sides of the planet simultaneously. The Germans assumed a zero-sum game, that every soldier sent to the Pacific was one less soldier for Europe. They did not understand that the U.S. economy was so vast it could build a Pacific Navy and an Atlantic Army at the same time. Then came the logistical miracle that broke the Atlantic barrier, the Liberty ship. The Germans calculated that they could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. It was a mathematical certainty to them, but they were using traditional shipbuilding math. They didn't know about Henry Kaiser. Kaiser's shipyards in California were turning out cargo ships with a speed that defied logic. In one publicity stunt, a Liberty ship was built from keel to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. By 1943, the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a barrier. It was a conveyor belt. The wolf packs of German U-boats were being hunted to extinction by new American technology, long-range bombers and radar that the Germans hadn't anticipated. The illusion of safety collapsed on June 6, 1944. When the Allied Armada appeared off the coast of Normandy on D-Day, it was the final refutation of Hitler's geography. The ocean had not protected Fortress Europe. Instead, the Allies had turned the Atlantic into the greatest logistical bridge in human history. They brought millions of men, thousands of tanks, and mountains of supplies across the water that Hitler thought was impassable. The two-front trap that Hitler had hoped to avoid, fighting the Soviets in the East and the Americans in the West, became his reality. He had relied on the Japanese to keep the Americans busy, and he had relied on the ocean to keep them away. Both bets failed. The Atlantic barrier was a myth born of continental thinking. The German leadership, obsessed with land and soil, never understood maritime power. They looked at the sea and saw a wall. the Americans looked at the sea and saw a road. That difference in perspective meant that by the time German sentries looked out from their bunkers on the French coast, it was already too late. The giant they thought was trapped in the Western Hemisphere had walked right across the water. By late 1944, the jokes about cowboys had stopped. The laughter in the Berlin cabarets about the uncultured Americans had been silenced, replaced by the low, terrified rumble of heavy bomber engines overhead. This is the final chapter of the German miscalculation, the awakening. For years, Nazi propaganda had sold a specific narrative, that the American mongrel society was too soft to endure the horrors of total war. They believed that once the casualty lists started arriving in New York and Chicago, the American public would demand peace. They believed the sleeping giant had a glass jaw. They were wrong. The giant did not ask for peace. It demanded unconditional surrender. The realization of this error arrived not on the ground, but from the sky. The most undeniable proof of American power was the destruction of the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring had famously boasted that no enemy plane would ever fly over the Reich. But by 1944, the sky belonged to the United States Army Air Forces. It wasn't just the technology, it was the relentlessness. German pilots were the best in the world, flying superior jet fighters like the Me-262 by the end of the war. But they were fighting a mathematical impossibility. For every German fighter shot down, the pilot was often lost forever. For every American P-51 Mustang shot down, another one, and another pilot was already on the way from the training fields of Texas. General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wrote to his wife about the terrible weight of the enemy. He wasn't talking about strategy. He was talking about the sky. German troops on the Western Front had a grim saying, "If the planes are camouflaged, they are British. If they are silver, they are American." The Americans didn't even bother to paint their planes anymore. They had such total air superiority that they didn't need to hide. On the ground, the Materialschlacht, the Battle of Material, became a nightmare for the Wehrmacht. There is a haunting account from a German panzer commander in the Battle of the Bulge. He was commanding a King Tiger, the most powerful tank of the war. It was a beast of steel, almost invulnerable to frontal fire. He destroyed 4 American Sherman tanks in a single engagement. But by late 1944, the jokes about cowboys had stopped. The laughter in the Berlin cabarets about the uncultured Americans had been silenced, replaced by the low, terrified rumble of heavy bomber engines overhead. This is the final chapter of the German miscalculation, the awakening. For years, Nazi propaganda had sold a specific narrative, that the American mongrel society was too soft to endure the horrors of total war. They believed that once the casualty lists started arriving in New York and Chicago, the American public would demand peace. They believed the sleeping giant had a glass jaw. They were wrong. The giant did not ask for peace. It demanded unconditional surrender. The realization of this error arrived not on the ground, but from the sky. The most undeniable proof of American power was the destruction of the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring had famously boasted that no enemy plane would ever fly over the Reich. But by 1944, the sky belonged to the United States Army Air Forces. It wasn't just the technology, it was the relentlessness. German pilots were the best in the world, flying superior jet fighters like the Me-262 by the end of the war. But they were fighting a mathematical impossibility. For every German fighter shot down, the pilot was often lost forever. For every American P-51 Mustang shot down, another one, and another pilot was already on the way from the training fields of Texas. General Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wrote to his wife about the terrible weight of the enemy. He wasn't talking about strategy. He was talking about the sky. German troops on the Western Front had a grim saying, "If the planes are camouflaged, they are British. If they are silver, they are American." The Americans didn't even bother to paint their planes anymore. They had such total air superiority that they didn't need to hide. On the ground, the Materialschlacht, The battle of material became